Hello, everyone. Just this brief introduction to this week's podcast edition of Listening to America. Joe Ellis is back. Founding Brothers, Passionate Sage, His Excellency, American Sphinx, all those books that Joe Ellis wrote that are crossover books. They pass academic muster, but they're also written for the general intelligent public. They're amazing. Joe and I worked on a Ken Burns film long ago, 25 years ago now, and have been friends ever since. But he's been available now in his retirement to be an occasional guest on these podcasts, and I'm thrilled to have him. You know, we do have to talk a little bit about Donald Trump and the clear and present danger, and I know that some of our listeners hate that. A, listeners who are conservative and are somewhat sympathetic to the MAGA movement, and B, people who are just tired of it. Do we have to talk about this ever again? And I apologize, but here's why you have to talk about it. Former President Trump has said in his long, careful interview with Time magazine, is primary evidence. He's talked about what he would do if he could do it if he's reelected. And that includes rounding up 12 million or more undocumented workers and putting them in camps, and then deporting them. Perhaps another Muslim or an attempt at a Muslim ban. Retribution against his political enemies. Dismantling the deep state as he understands it. These are things that either it's just bluff, and maybe it is, or he means it. And I think it's somewhere in between. It's some of both. But if you believe as a historian, if you're Joe Ellis and you've spent your life writing about how the struggle to build a more perfect union, to build a constitutional structure with checks and balances and separation of powers and guardrails, and that the Founding Fathers were worried about a time when there would be a kind of runaway demagoguery amongst the people and certain leaders, then you can't not look at this. I mean, how can you think that what former President Trump represents is benign or harmless if he's intending to dismantle carefully created constitutional norms? So it's a dilemma. I don't want to talk about this. I've been saying in all of my public lectures and in the things that I'm writing that it's not about Trump. It's about the rage, the grievance, the frustration, the sense that change is coming too hard, too fast, and that the reaction is an inevitable reaction. And that we should try to understand and we should try to respect even that which we find really bewildering. And so I don't want this to be like Trump bashing, but he demands it. Alas, I don't want this conversation. Joe Ellis is too important to lose in that sector. So as soon as we talked a little bit about that, we got on to the Founding Fathers, Adams, Jefferson, Washington, and it became, in my opinion, even more interesting. And of course, if you ask someone as eminent as Joe Ellis to be on the podcast, you have to let Joe Ellis be Joe Ellis. He's great. If you haven't read his books, I would suggest that you start with Passionate Sage about Adams. Or if Jefferson's your guy, then read American Sphinx. I'm in that one. I'm in the preface. I helped to touch off some of his thinking about it, not necessarily in a good way, at an event in Worcester, Massachusetts at the American Antiquarian Society long ago. We worked on a Ken Burns film together. He's still writing. He's a wonderful storyteller. He is passionately patriotic, loves this country, wants us to thrive. He's skeptical about everything, including his own guide, John Adams. And he's just a delight to be around. And so even if some part of the conversation today rubs you slightly the wrong way, just stay with it because he's so interesting and he's deserved his eminence. He earned every bit of his eminence. And I'm just delighted to be able to call him my colleague and my friend. The theme is America 250. And at the end, we really talk about it. You can't understand this country unless you understand the founders. You can't understand this country unless you understand that they were people like other people with strengths and weaknesses. You can't understand America 250 unless you understand the primacy of race, the agony of race in American history. You can't understand this country if you don't understand that the founders didn't intend the Constitution to be forever. They intended it to be for a while, and it would be replaced by a more perfect instrument as people realize that it has strengths and weaknesses, that in some ways it straitjackets the country, and that it perpetuated some really problematic structures. For example, that even the puniest little states like Wyoming, Alaska, North Dakota, Vermont get 2 senators, and California with 50 million people gets just 2 senators. So what a day. I'm exhausted now, and I'm delighted to have this role to be able to bring to you so many interesting perspectives by such extraordinary thinkers, writers, pundits, lovers of this country, of which I consider myself one. So let's go to the program. Thanks, everybody. Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson, the day after Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Just this introduction to the conversation I had a couple of weeks ago in June with Joe Ellis, the great historian of the early national period. Joe and I are talking in a series of conversations about the founding vision of the United States and how it is played out over the course of American history. And we both agree, of course, that the 35 words at the heart of the Declaration of Independence are, in a sense, the mission statement for the very utopian dream of America. We discussed all of this, and we're trying to sort of gauge the strength and health of the Republic over time. You know, Jefferson and John Adams died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In 1876, the country celebrated, but it was just at that moment that they learned that George Custer and more than 260 of his men had been wiped out. I remember the bicentennial of the United States in 1976, a time when we were reeling from not only Watergate and Vietnam, but also the Church Committee hearings that showed that the United States was complicit in coups d'etats and assassination plots in Central and South America. We weren't exactly a cheerful, self-satisfied, optimistic nation in 1976, and we certainly aren't in 2026. And that's really the burden of our conversation, to try to say this is not unique. We've been here before. America is always becoming and never finished. And that, thank goodness for Thomas Jefferson setting the goal so high, setting the standard at such a high pitch that we will always feel compelled to measure ourselves against the dream that he particularly, among the founding fathers, articulated for us. So anyway, that's the context. Joe and I will be speaking again soon, and now we will have more information because between the time of that conversation and today, the Biden presidency has effectively collapsed because of the perception that he might be too old for the job. President Trump was nearly assassinated in Pennsylvania. The Republican National Convention has occurred. As I record these words near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, we are really bracing ourselves for what will probably be one of the most chaotic political seasons of our lifetime. So let's go to the program. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I am delighted to bring back to this conversation my friend Joe Ellis, one of my favorite people in the world, great historian, winner of many prizes, still writing in retirement, living at an undisclosed location in Vermont. Welcome, Joe.
It is great to be back with you, Clay.
So, as you know, I'm trying to figure out America as we approach our 250th birthday. A kind of impossible task, and I think we're more scattered and distracted and disrupted than we've been in my lifetime. But I know that our listeners have been wanting to hear you for a long time. We've had a kind of hiatus. I'm glad you're back. So this is the question I think that you want to start with, and that is, what's the mission statement of the United States?
Boy, that's a biggie. What's the mission statement of the United States? To sustain its role as the dominant military and economic power in the world while staying true to the values which we claim to be dear and we honor every day in the Pledge of Allegiance. In addition to being all the things we are as a society, we're deeply divided over what those last words really mean. And in my own judgment, the election that's coming upon us, presidential election, is the most important of my lifetime. And given my age, that means for an awful lot of other Americans, too. I, as a historian, would say it's the second most important presidential election in American history.
Previous one?
1860.
So in the 1850s, the early two-party system broke down, and suddenly people gather and form what we then call the Republican Party. The 16th president of the United States becomes Abraham Lincoln. This is, in a sense, the birth of the success of the Republican Party. And here we are a century and a half later, and the Republican Party does not seem to be the same one.
The Republican Party, which called itself the Party of Lincoln for many years, is no longer the Party of Lincoln. We need a center-right party in the United States, but starting in Nixon's presidency, in the wake of the decision the decision to grant the Voting Rights Act of 1966, when Lyndon Johnson made that decision, he was told by his close friend, the governor or the senator from Georgia, whose name escapes me.
Richard Russell. Richard Russell was the senator.
There you go. Thank you. You do this. If we do this, the Democratic Party will lose the South for the next 30 years. Well, that was 60 years ago. And the Southern strategy of Nixon allowed for the capture of the former Confederacy by the Republican Party. And at that point, it stopped being the party of Lincoln. And in that sense, I think that Donald Trump isn't an aberration. He's a continuation of a trend where the race issue especially is viewed differently than Lincoln viewed it. At some point here, we're going to have to head back to a guy who you knew or know very well and you portrayed for many years. I think that he is the author of the magic words of American history that Lincoln referred to in the Gettysburg Address when he officially declared that the war was about slavery, not just about states' rights. But those are the magic words that I've memorized. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are established among men. How does it end?
Their just powers.
Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What those words mean, and the argument over what those words mean is to some extent the argument at the core of our current presidential election. We're going to decide to go forward or go backward. And that sounds like a prejudicial version, but it's really not, in the sense that I acknowledge that there's a significant portion of the American electorate that really, for honest reasons, deeply felt reasons, wants to go backward. And in this election, one thing I wanted to get in right away is I encourage everybody to vote, but to vote for one of two candidates, Trump or Biden. One of those two men will be the next president. A vote for any of the third-party candidates is a wasted vote. And so those supporting Biden and those supporting Trump know what they want to do. And I'm really talking to a lot of the voters who haven't decided, and especially among younger voters, and encourage them in this atmosphere that's full of misinformation, loaded with lies, to try to find out the truth about the records of both men.
You say it's the most important election of your lifetime. And I believe you. You know, that phrase gets bandied about every 4 years by somebody or other. But you are a historian. You've looked at the record. We've been through some difficult times: 1968, 1969, 1974, 1975. There have been lots of difficult moments in American history, and of course, the whopper, the giant one, is the Civil War in the 1860s, where we just actually broke down into amazing violence, almost 800,000 people killed. To say something like that, it's easy for a citizen to say, you know, a low information American who got some schooling but doesn't really know much. You know a great deal about all of us, and you are saying this election on the 5th of November 2024 is the most important of your lifetime. Explain that.
My lifetime starts in 1943, and none of those elections qualify. But I do say, coming to the Civil War in 1860, it makes me regard the election of 1860 as the most important and more important than this one.
Yes.
But being second most important is still high on the list. I'm worried about the electorate. Only about 10% of the voting electorate could pass the civics test that new immigrants are required to pass for citizenship. History enrollments are down throughout the nation. People no longer get their news from a few sources who filter it. They get through their cell phones, and the whole informational atmosphere is saturated with misinformation, exaggeration, lies. 3 generations of Americans have grown up without any sense that they had a social or civic obligation to serve. I'm in favor of mandatory national service, not necessarily military service, but in some capacity, environmental, whatever, so that the electorate that will be voting in this particular election is troublesome to me. And all I can say is between now and November, those of you who haven't decided to really find a source of information you trust and make your judgment accordingly.
All right, now, Joe, let me ask you this question. Are we in danger of national collapse? Is it possible that our constitutional order, our republic, could collapse into autocracy or quasi-fascism or fascism or civil war? Is there a chance that we're about to have another widespread episode of violence and chaos?
Historians are really good at predicting the past.
Yes.
We're not any better than most everybody else in predicting the future.
But you're worried.
But I'm concerned, yes. I don't think civil war is in the cards. I do think if Trump wins, he has declared himself the desire to be, in an interview with Time magazine in May, he described the agenda he intended to pursue. And he said he would be a dictator for a day, but that really means once you become a dictator, and dictators then assume control of the levers of power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, I think it would be difficult for Trump to take the oath of office, but of course he will. But the oath of office requires him to pledge allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. Trump doesn't believe in the rule of law in the same way that Biden does.
Or John Kennedy, or Richard Nixon, or Ronald Reagan, or Gerald Ford, or Harry Truman.
Right. We've had demagogues before, but never before have they made it to the White House. However, I don't believe that the structure of the republic will be destroyed. I believe that it's resilient, and I believe that it won't be the end of the American republic. I do think it will be a difficult and a dangerous time, but I believe that it has the capacity and the grounding to survive. The military take an oath of allegiance not to the president, but to the Constitution. It's going to be very difficult for any president to force them to do things that they believe are unconstitutional.
We need to take a break, Joe. Talking to the great Joseph Ellis, the author of more than a dozen books, many of them award-winning, more coming. Frequent guest on this program. We've missed you. We'll be back with this special edition of Listening to America in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking with my friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis, now living in an undisclosed location in Vermont. Joe.
Let me turn the questions on you for just a second.
Oh, dear.
Do I get to do that? I think
sure, yes, of course.
You asked me the ultimate unanswerable question. If Trump wins the election, will we become an autocracy and will we destroy the republic? And I gave you a sort of mixed answer, but basically no. If you were posing that same question to yourself, what would your answer be?
Well, you know how this works. I'm a man. I'm a man in the seventh inning of my life, a white American man, so a person of privilege. I've never been arbitrarily roughed up by a cop. I've never been profiled. I don't believe I've ever been discriminated against. So there's that. I'm also a citizen. And as a citizen, I have a certain response to things that are going on in the country. And then I'm also a historian. I'm not a historian of your caliber, but I'm a historian too, and I know a great deal about the founding generation and the sort of founding ideals of America. And so, as you know, we have to try to figure out what weight to give things and how to balance these different people that we are, because as a person who's centrist but slightly left of center, I'm deeply worried about the future. As a historian, our attitude is almost certainly supposed to be, well, don't overestimate the drama of your own times. There have been difficulties through history, perspective, and context. But here's the thing about this. Everyone says about Trump, the problem is you take him literally, but not seriously. You need to take him seriously, but not literally. What he has said, and in the Time magazine interview and in other interviews, was that he would round up, put into camps, and deport 12 million or more people he calls illegal aliens. Can he do that? I doubt it. Will he try? Maybe. But he might try, but I don't think he can do that. He says that he will get retribution, that he has the right now, after what he's gone through, to go after his political opponents and to use the FBI and the judicial system to try to damage them or jail them. He might try that. I don't think that he will be able to do that. Do you?
No, I don't. I think he will succeed in a couple of cases, but not generally. And I think that one of the things you're saying is that Donald Trump makes a lot of promises. Most of them never come true.
But so is it bluff? Is it just bluster? Is it just demagoguery? In other words, I think that he would like to be the autocrat, the unitary president who can do more or less what he wants. He has said that openly many times. Our system held, the guardrails held. I don't think they held by much in 2020. Imagine if the people who stormed the Capitol had AR-15s, or imagine if they've gotten a hold of Mike Pence. Imagine if they'd gotten a hold of Nancy Pelosi. I don't know what would have happened, but that could have been a much, much worse day than it turned out to be. So here's the question. I'll throw it back at you. I'm worried. I'm deeply worried, especially because now Trumpites, including Republicans who know way better, are echoing his distaste for the judicial system, are saying that it was a sham trial, are saying that the FBI has been politicized, are saying that you can't trust our government due process anymore. That's very, very dangerous thinking. It's one thing for Trump to talk that way. It's a very different thing for others to talk that way. And I don't know what kind of Kool-Aid they're drinking, but they know better. They know better than to do that. We know what Trump says he would do. We also know that he probably can't get away with much of that. But even the things that he can get away with are not in keeping with your idea of separation of powers, due process, checks and balances, norms, living within the norms of peaceful transitions of power and so on. I think the best case scenario, if he wins, is 4 more years of chaos.
I think I don't disagree with the thrust of your remarks. One of the things you're saying is that Trump and the Trumpers have learned how to do things that they want to do better than they would before, and that the Republican Party has become the mega party in the Trump party. The Republican Party in its historic identity doesn't exist anymore. And they actually, I've always thought the biggest lie in American history was the idea that the Civil War was not about slavery. Now, as a competitor, is that the election of the most recent election, 1820, was rigged and that Trump actually won. That's really a big lie. But the bulk of the Republican Party has bought into that. I think the elusive way to put it is we'll be in for a difficult 4 years where the fabric of the republic is threatened, but it doesn't break.
But Joe, here's the question. We both believe in the idea of election. So it may happen that the American people vote him back into power, and they know what he said that he will do, and they know the things that he did attempt to do in his first term. It's not as if he's some mystery coming out of nowhere. It's very problematic because we both believe that elections matter, and if the American people want to elect such and such a person, they have that right to do so, as long as it's an election on fair terms and so on.
But what we know for a fact is that, because he said it, if Trump loses the election, he won't accept the result.
Right.
And that will produce chaos, but it won't produce a civil war. If he wins the election, and he does have an opportunity to attempt to implement his agenda, he will not succeed in any substantial way, but he will cause chaos. It will be a difficult 4 years for all of us, for me at least. Again, historians can predict the past quite clearly. I can tell you who wins the American Revolution. I can tell you who won the Super Bowl last year, but I can't tell you how it's going to play if Trump wins. I can tell you if he doesn't win, how it's going to play. It's going to play like January 6th all over again.
You said early in our conversation that the people who vote for him, who look to him for leadership, have to be taken seriously. In other words, they're Americans. Yeah. They have the right to vote. They have their own idea of what America should be. We don't have to agree with them. That's the nature of a democratic society. One of the mistakes I think that the left has made is to demonize them and to call them yokels and rubes and idiots and so on. Whatever you might personally think of them, they are a voting bloc. And they're upset, they're filled with rage, they feel that they have been ignored, they feel that they have been belittled, they feel that they have been condescended to, that they've been told that they're not politically correct, that their entertainments are sneered at by satirists and so on. They've been in a bad mood for a long time, and they've been in a really, really bad mood lately. And they have a right to vote, and they have a right to prevail if they can prevail. So how can we take their grievances, their anxieties, their frustrations, their fear of change seriously, and yet also believe that what Trump represents is a clear and present danger to the American system?
Well, I agree with the thrust of what you just said, Clay. I think they constitute 30 to 40% of the electorate, and that they are the base of the former Republican Party, which is why the Republican Party has become Trump's party. They want to make America great again. What does again mean to them? Well, I think it means before the United States committed itself to being a biracial or multiracial society, and before patriarchy was destroyed and women began to enter the workforce and crash through the glass ceiling. It's kind of Ozzie and Harriet America, and I'm not using that term frivolously. You really can't make history go backward. And in the history of all political movements that see the future in the past is short-lived. What's the name of the party in the 19th century? The Know-Nothing Party.
Know-Nothings.
Yeah, the Know-Nothings. They were against my ancestors, the Irish and the Catholics, and all immigrants.
And then we let you in.
Yeah, we got in anyway. And
yes.
Can you imagine when my family arrived from Ireland in the wake of the Irish famine, and they landed on an island which was named Ellis Island.
After you.
They thought this has got to be a great place here, And but that's the Irish. I have a German side too. But I'm concerned. I'm worried. We are at an inflection point. That's what we've been saying all throughout this interview. We'll run a risky course. But in my heart of hearts, I believe the principles that we established at the founding and the vision that Lincoln had and that before him Jefferson had. Lincoln was really mouthing Jefferson.
Saving Jefferson from himself in some ways.
Yeah, that's right. And that you can't turn those things around. I can tell you from one thing, I taught at Mount Holyoke College, an all-women's college for a long time. They're coming, baby. You try to stop that genie is out of the bottle. And just take a look at the American team that's going to walk into Paris in 2 weeks.
Our Olympic team, yeah.
Our Olympic team. It's the most multiracial team in the world. And that's the reason we're going to win more medals than anybody else. It's a society that now draws from the strength and the ability and the talent of all of its members, regardless of their race or their gender. That's what makes us so strong, as well as immigration, which, most of these people are not taking jobs that others want. They're taking jobs they won't do. Although I think we do have a serious problem on the Mexican border, no doubt about that. But that we're becoming a society in which women and all people, regardless of race, who are talented. And notice in the entertainment industry and the sports or athletics, talent and ability is transparent. It's obvious. Like if you can run the 100 in 9.7 and somebody else can only run it in 10.2, you're going to get on the team. And guess what? Take a look at every team in the National Basketball Association, the National Football Association, including all the football teams in red states like the SEC. Everybody in the audience, not everybody, but a bulk of the audience are all Trump voters. But they're voting for teams that are usually over half African American. You're not going to be able to end that. And you're not going to be able to change that.
So, Joe, one way to look at this, I believe that Donald Trump is a clear and present danger, and he says so. I mean, he has told us what his view of America is. He's told us what he wants to punish. He's told us that he has in mind retribution. He's told us that he wants to have mass deportations, that he tried to have a Muslim ban, and so on. So it's not as if we're making this up. He has told us what he is and what he wants to do, and he has millions of people who may not want all of that, but they like him better than the alternatives, and we get that. But I'm trying to make sure that we respect them, even if we disagree so profoundly with them. Part of this is fear, isn't it? There's, so much has changed. It's been a time of breathtaking technological change, social change in gender. I mean, 20 years ago, people didn't understand that gender was a construction, the average American. Most of us didn't. And now we have a very different idea of what gender is. There's a more fluidity about it. Same-sex marriage has come. We have gay preachers. We have gay professors. I can remember when we used to say a gay teacher in a school was going to be a sexual predator. Well, it turns out that's not true at all, and so on. So lots of change has come. And some of this change hits head on some deeply received biblical truths that people have had for centuries. And so many people are bewildered and fearful and sort of beside themselves with not knowing how do you adjust. And I think many honest people feel that the browning of America is a threat. We used to have a narrative of America. You know that narrative that Columbus bumps into the New World, and then comes Jamestown and the Pilgrims, and they have initially so-so relations with natives, but soon the natives have to be pushed aside. And then there's the frontier movement and Conestoga wagons and the beaver trade and so on. You know that narrative, and that narrative was a Eurocentric, largely triumphalist narrative, a self-satisfied narrative about America in the world and how we became this 50-state, as Stephen Ambrose used to say, sea to shining sea republic. You know that narrative. That's the narrative you grew up listening to. And since the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the women's movement, African American studies, Chicano studies, the rise of American Indian, the AIM movement and American Indian rights, that the story has become immensely more complex. It's not a simple, tidy, triumphalist narrative anymore. And we have to adjust to that. And it's no longer tidy, and it's no longer so optimistic. It's no longer so self-serving. And because of that, because it's so much more problematic as a narrative than it ever was, there are people that just want to reject it and wish it would go away. It can't take us back to a simpler time when we can still believe that Laura Ingalls Wilder, even though they were squatting on Indian land out there in Kansas, but that they were American heroes. You see my point, that we've lost that narrative because now it's so much more complex. And you've been part of that. Patricia Limerick has been part of that. Richard White has been part of that. The great minds of the country have said, folks, it's not as simple as you thought. Jefferson may have been a great guy, but he was a racist. Folks, it's not as simple as you thought. Andrew Jackson was maybe our first Democratic president, but he also had the Trail of Tears. And I think that now we're all sort of disenchanted with the narrative because it's not as fun as it used to be.
Well, even though it's not as fun, or it's not as one-sided, it's not as blind to the negative side. My whole thing, this is really important. You mentioned that you've got to be able to hold two ideas in your mind at the same time. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald said that was the measure of intelligence. And I'm not prepared to endorse the old imperialistic, white racist view of it all. On the other hand, the founding was an extraordinarily successful moment in global and certainly in American history. And the values embedded at that time and the creation of a republic where power resides with the people rather than with kings and God and people with divine information, that was a major achievement. That greatness and failure coexist, okay? That the founders, I mean, you've read my book on Adams. Adams, has got a lot of bad qualities to him. I mean, Washington is going to disappoint you here and there, and Jefferson's really going to disappoint.
But let me just interrupt to say Washington is the least disappointing of that group.
He is. Among the Virginians, he's the only one that freed his slaves. And actually, very few people know this. In his first meeting with the cabinet, Jefferson was the one who was appalled to hear this. He said, I want you all to know that if this sectional fight becomes a civil war, I want you to know that I will go with the North. And I expect my followers to do the same. From that point forward, Mount Vernon became a Trojan horse buried in Virginia. And by the way, I was born and raised a Virginian. I went to the College of William and Mary, and I was taught the states' rights theory of history and all that kind of stuff. The founders themselves are not gods. They're imperfect human beings. The founding was a truly extraordinary moment in the history of Western thought, but they failed to achieve the full implications of the American promise. And that is only now beginning to be delivered by the society. But that the coexistence of greatness and failure, that's what history is. Have you ever met a perfect human being in your whole life?
Well, only you. So, Joe, we have to take a break here in a minute, but let's look at it this way. So Jefferson launches those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He can't live up to them, but he knows better, but he can't live up to them. American history is, in a sense, the rereading and reinterpretation and reinvigoration of those words from decade to decade and era to era, moving closer and closer to a full realization of that. And every time we make that leap, whether it's Reconstruction in the 1870s, late 60s and 70s, or the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, or the gender movements and so on that are going on now, every time we move closer to that ideal, there is resistance and resentment and anxiety and pushback. And that's part of how it works, isn't it?
You are on to the longest theme in American history. It's the backlash syndrome. Martin Luther King said the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And he's right, but it's not a straight line. It's like a roller coaster ride. And every major step forward on the civil rights front generates a reaction. And in some sense, we're going through the fourth or fifth, depending on how you count, chapter in that story. You earlier had said, there is no narrative in America. Well, there is. That's the narrative. Jefferson's words are a convenient way to say what the promise is. But that the failures that accompany that and the ways we have to step backward is the central theme in American political history.
Joe, we have to take a break. I want to continue this conversation when we come back. I'll say just before we go to break, though, that it's not just the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution's great preamble, written by Gouverneur Morris, says a more perfect union, and we continue to struggle for that. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America with my extraordinarily important guest, Dr. Joseph Ellis. I don't even know how to make sense of your extraordinary career, Joe. All those books and so many of them award-winning, and most historians, I think, at our universities and colleges are doing good work, but they don't move the needle much. Maybe they impact some students and they help create some PhDs, and most publication doesn't really have much of a splash. But you've had it. Your books are crossover books, and one of the things you've told me before is that you write to pass muster with the severe academics, but to be available to intelligent people who are not academics, and that's a genius. You've talked about how you crafted your prose style, that you're always thinking about the reader when you're writing, that you're not writing dull monographs with tedious scholastic arguments and so on. You've moved the needle, and that has to give you great satisfaction.
It does. It's talking to me at my desk here. I spend 4 to 6 hours a day here. I remember I was on the book chat trail once, and young guy came up and said, I read this paragraph in the book you wrote called Founding Brothers, and what a great paragraph. He describes it, and I said, he said, it must be great to be able to sit down and just write that. And I said, yeah, that paragraph took 3 days.
Exactly.
And you're right. My audience is not purely academic. I want to satisfy their scholarly standards, but my audience is the kind of students I taught. Intelligent, bright, interested in history, and know nothing. And the ability to tell a story. I don't know how you get that, but I don't know.
You got it.
But somehow, when I was thinking of leaving Yale, because I wasn't happy there in graduate school, C. Van Woodward talked me into it. Great historian, great man, great historian, talked me into it. And I said, well, Professor Woodward, I just don't know as much as all these guys from Princeton and all this stuff. I need to major in history as an undergraduate, major in philosophy. And he said, you're right, Joe. They know more than you do, but you can learn what they know. You know something they can never learn. I spent the last 50 years trying to figure out what it was that I knew. But I think it has something to do with tell a story.
Let me go back to Jefferson. He is my hero. He's a bit of a tarnished hero, but he is my hero. I think that if we were a more Jeffersonian nation, minus the race stuff, we'd be infinitely better off than we are. Jefferson understood that it's a republic, that the people need to be educated rigorously if they're going to be up to this challenge, that we need some filters. That, remember, he said that the first secretion of the people's will is seldom a distinguished one, meaning the House, but the Senate at one remove. So Jefferson understood all this. He also said you need to have rituals of national renewal, including tearing up the Constitution from time to time. And
that's a biggie. The last thing is a biggie. He really thought you should rewrite the Constitution every generation, every 20 years.
Right.
And that's one thing that as a historian, I feel strongly about. If the founders are looking back at us from up in high, they're thinking, what are you doing? You should have changed this Constitution in basic ways. You should do away with the Electoral College. You should revise the Senate. There's all kinds of things that need to be done, but it's impossible to do.
From within. That's why he wanted to force it by every 19 years, right?
That's right.
And here's what I really object to in Jefferson, his magical thinking. He thought slavery would somehow benignly just fade away. It didn't. The cotton gin gave slavery a whole new front. Jefferson thought Native Americans would somehow just move out of the way and that there wouldn't have to be Indian wars and there wouldn't have to be all the violence and trails of tears and so on. He's always thinking of a magical solution to the fundamental problems of America. And someone like Washington, or Adams for that matter, thought, no, that's not how it works. You're going to have to sit down and hammer this stuff out.
Jefferson's mind operates best at a very high altitude. He can conceive of a utopian kind of America. But remember that the Greek meaning of utopia is nowhere. He was really good in saying, when told that the Constitution should remain the way it is, he said, for the subsequent generations to retain this Constitution in this way, it would be like me as an old boy, as an old man trying to wear the sweater I had as a child. So he's good on that. But he's also, the secret of his success is he's like the dirigible at the Super Bowl. He seems to flash inspirational messages to both sides. Both sides in the Civil War thought they were fighting principles of Thomas Jefferson, right? And
the dirigible, that's the strangest metaphor ever for Jefferson.
I've never heard it. I just made it up. But Jefferson has a way of pitching through his magic words and his ability at the English language. Only Lincoln can compare to him.
Lincoln's better. Lincoln's even better.
Yes, he probably is. I think he is too. And really, it's Lincolnizes the Jefferson message more than Jefferson himself did. If you said, Joe, who would you like to have lunch with or dinner with, have a drink with among the founders? My first choice would be Adams, because he'd tell you the truth.
But you're going to get much better wine with Jefferson. You're going to get exquisite wine and French cuisine.
My non-choice was Washington. He wouldn't tell you anything. But Jefferson, you'd get great wine and great conversation. And he'd find a way to deflect it from the areas where it might be threatening to some of his own less than impressive things. He's really good at that. Once you're in Monticello, you're in his territory, and he can steer the conversation and take you to see the University of Virginia, and you can never get around to it. He's a genius at that kind of thing, too.
Another piece of the magic of Jefferson is that almost nobody crossed that invisible red line, that somehow it became clear that when you're with Jefferson, you don't bring up certain subjects. You don't confront him about his duplicity, about his racism, about slavery, about Sally Hemings. There was kind of a tacit understanding that when you're with Jefferson, you don't go there. And how he made that happen without having Madison tell people at the door, please don't ask, please don't raise these questions. That's one thing. The second thing, and that's a magic about Jefferson, I've never understood it. The second thing is the one person who actually nailed Jefferson right to the wall was Abigail Adams.
He wrote her a letter in which she had written him when one of his daughters died, whom she'd known. And he wrote back, and he said he was glad to be back in touch, and that he had forgiven Adams for appointing the midnight judges. And this drove Abigail nuts. And she wrote him the only letter. I've read the entire Jefferson correspondence, and I suspect you read most, if not all of it, too. That's a hell of a lot.
26,000 letters.
Only private letter that he got in which he was called out. And she did it. He thought maybe John was behind it and was looking there. And John had nothing. John saw the letter months later and said, "I have recently been made aware of this. I have nothing to say about it whatsoever."
At this time.
It's Abigail who tells him the truth. And she loved him because they'd met and spent a lot of time in Paris.
But Joe, in that letter, in that famous 1804 exchange that they had, a couple of things. One is that Jefferson said, the one thing that really bothered me about your husband was those midnight appointments, and I would have thought that it was gentlemanly for it to leave to his successor and so on. She said, look, Buster, the Constitution makes you the president until the minute you leave. He had a duty to fill those vacancies. You're completely on your constitutional theory is no good. So she's lecturing one of our best political thinkers on constitutional interpretation. And then she says, and by the way, the serpent that you cherished, meaning James Callender, came back to bite you, didn't he? I mean, he must have winced for weeks after that letter.
And Abigail's the greatest first lady in American history, by the way. I think she might even be greater than Miss Roosevelt. But
top 5 anyway. But so Joe, and then when Benjamin Rush brought Jefferson and Adams back into correspondence, remember that Jefferson said in the negotiations back and forth, okay, maybe, but as long as I don't have to address her.
I didn't know that.
He didn't want to ever have to, but then it worked out. They forgave each other.
They do reestablish their friendship in a way that's really interesting and impressive. I've written a lot about this, but Adams put it so nicely. He said, you and I ought not to die until we have explained ourselves to each other. And they are two sides of the revolution.
More than Jefferson and Hamilton, it's Jefferson and Adams.
That is right. And both of them are major forces in the revolution, but both of them disagree about what the full implications of the American Revolution are. So when we talk about the founders, everybody thinks we're talking about a single unit. These are people who don't always agree at all. And that's really one of the strengths. It's a built-in form of checks and balances in the personalities of the founders, as well as in the structure of the Constitution. But that correspondence between Adams and Jefferson, I used to assign all the time. And that's where anyone that wants to look at the founding, that's the first place to begin.
Those chapters of your book, Passionate Sage, are amongst my favorite of all the things that you have ever written, partly because of you, but partly, of course, because of the sheer beauty and richness of that correspondence. And remember, when Abigail dies, Jefferson writes what John Adams says is the greatest condolence letter possible. That when Jefferson is Jefferson, when he's on, there's nobody like him.
Yeah, he can be great in that regard. And he concedes in one of the letters, when they're talking about the French Revolution, and he says, on that, you were right and I was wrong. I couldn't imagine Napoleon, I couldn't imagine thousands and hundreds of thousands of casualties. And Adams took the letter and he read it out loud at his breakfast table with all his kids and his grandkids around. This is the greatest letter ever written. And it's the way in which the friendship finally, completely is recovered there.
That's the only full concession that Jefferson made, because as you know, in the Adams-Jefferson correspondence between 1812 and 1826, every third or fourth letter, Adams is trying to pick a big fight with Jefferson and say, you were wrong, I was right, you were wrong, why'd you do this, how dare you that? And Jefferson usually said, the weather has been great here and my crops are looking pretty good, I've got these grandchildren.
Sure, I have in my mind is Jefferson standing still with his arms across his chest, protecting himself, and Adams pacing back and forth in front of him, periodically grabbing him by the lapel and saying, oh, what do you think about this? Adams is more argumentative, but as a biographer, you're the prisoner of the sources that the person, the man or the woman, leaves you. And Adams leaves you more about what he really thinks and feels than anybody, including Jefferson.
Jefferson doesn't tell you what he feels about almost anything.
Right. Washington's worse than that. Washington, you read his diary, say, what's he thinking on the day that he's retiring? A day like all days, 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, but Joe, remember that letter that Washington writes before he enters the presidency, and he says, I feel like a culprit on death row going to the gallows.
Like a prisoner being taken to his death sentence or something like that. Yeah. No president in American history did not want to be president more than George Washington.
I want to go to one more thing about Jefferson as long as we're on this. If you went to the 1,000 or so people who have been convicted and put in prison because of January 6th and had a nice, quiet, respectful conversation with them, their two philosophers, their two legitimizers are Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. They believe that they are the rump that still believes that you have to resist, that the tree of liberty must be refreshed, that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Jefferson is the philosopher of that strain in American anti-government feeling. Now, that's maybe a misreading of Jefferson, but you know that that's what he occupies.
It is a misreading, but it's available for someone who wants to grab it. That's true. Patrick Henry, it depends on what you mean by liberty, but give me life. Unbeknownst to them, they were squashing the very values that both Jefferson and Henry claimed they were fighting for in the American Revolution. They wanted to embrace those values, and they're smart to try to do that, or wise in trying to do that. But in the end, they have to reverse the American flag. And that's not what anybody else would do.
And of course, Supreme Court justices, or at least their wives too. So Joe, we're just about out of time. want to come back to our larger theme here. So, A, these propositions, yes or no? You can't understand America 250 unless you come to terms with the Founding Fathers. B, you have to realize that the founders were imperfect human beings like all human beings. C, you have to really accept the main line of Jefferson's thinking, that this is a dynamic country, the most dynamic society in the world. And if you think you can govern yourself in the 21st century with an 18th century instrument, you're just joking.
Completely agree.
D, that the bedeviling central problem of American life, and there have been lots of them, but the central problem has been race. It begins right off the bat. It's bedeviled us ever since. We thought, every time we think we have come to terms with it, and remember when Obama was elected and so many people believed we were now in a post-racial era, that problem has been central to everything and it doesn't go away. And you can despise the 1619 Project and all of that if you want, but the fact is race is fundamental to any understanding of our history.
Agree on the fundamental values of critical race theory are correct. The way they implement them historically is historically incorrect.
And the righteousness of some of it is incorrect too, but their insight is correct.
Yes, and 1619 and 76. If the barricades ever go up, we'll all be on the same side. The first African Americans to arrive in Virginia did not come in 1619, and the ones that did come were not enslaved. And the war for independence was not a war to preserve slavery. So they're wrong on both of those counts. But the people that embrace that are themselves correct in calling attention to the centrality of race as an abiding presence and racial prejudice as a permanent layer right beneath the surface of American society.
Don't you think that at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, one possibility was to call the bluff of the Carolinas in Georgia and say, okay, if you're not going to sign on, go thy ways. But we're not embedding slavery into the Constitution of the United States. Gouverneur Morris felt that way. James Wilson felt that way. Even Madison, to a certain degree, felt that way. And yet they succumbed. And we've been held hostage by that element in American life ever since.
If they had taken that position, we would have never got the Constitution. It would have never passed, and it would have never been ratified. And by the way, North Carolina, South Carolina mostly, said it, and then they didn't have to secede from the Union. All they had to do was vote against it, and you would have had to have the Articles of Confederation remain the government of the country. And by the way, the Articles of Confederation are exactly what the Confederacy adopted in 1861. I don't even think we would have won the war before that. You needed the Southern states to support the Revolution, and you needed Southern states to support the Constitution. And think of it this way, too. The 19th century abolitionists, who were mostly Quakers, say they should have simply let the South, go, let them go.
There were voices that said, call their bluff. There were voices.
Let's take two examples of revolution. Two other examples. In France, they do attempt to implement the full implications of their agenda, the radical agenda. What do you get? You get the guillotine and Napoleon. In Russia, they do the same thing. What do you get? You get the firing squad Wall and Stalin, or Lenin and Stalin. The deferral of that agenda was, in my judgment, a great act of political leadership on their part. And the people like Washington and, for a while, Madison are saying the only way we can end slavery is with a federal government empowered to make domestic and foreign policy. The irony is the only way to make sure you don't get that is to insert this issue of slavery into the debate. And this is one of Lincoln's points. Slavery, or the word slave, is never used in the Constitution at all. And most of them meaning people like Washington, Madison, Adams, although Jefferson and Adams were not present, as you know, they thought that we could begin to end slavery in 1808. We would get through the time when republics are most vulnerable in their early years, and that's the year that the slave trade will end. And once that happens, we can seriously address frontally this issue. That's what they thought they were doing. They weren't abandoning the issue, but they were deferring the issue. And I think of that as an act of political leadership rather than political failure.
Agreed. And of course, the person who proposed that to Congress in 1808 was Thomas Jefferson, saying, this anniversary has come. The Founding Fathers postponed it until 1808. That moment is here. Let's do it. And they did it.
I had forgotten that. You're right, though.
But Joe, two things. One is, the key date, in my opinion, in this discussion on this issue is 1793, the invention of the cotton gin.
There's a debate in 1790 in the Congress that's forced by the Abolitionist Society and by a letter that Franklin sends to forces them. And when that fails, I think abolition is in the coffin. And then there are nails in the coffin, like the insurrection in the Caribbean,
in Haiti,
then the Cotton Kingdom with the Cotton Gin, then the Missouri Compromise. These are just nails in the coffin, but abolition is dead already, I think.
We have to leave it there for the moment. What a wonderful conversation, Joe. I want to keep this conversation going. Let's talk in a couple of weeks and take this to another level. And one of the things I want to talk about is John Brown. I'm fascinated by John Brown, but for the moment we have to say goodbye. Thanks to Professor Joseph Ellis, and we'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.